Good evening, one and all, and welcome to the Galaxy 3 Theater. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to the stage, direct from Burke County, North Carolina, the doctor of stand-up comedy, Roho M.D.
Yeah, they call me Roho M.D. The M.D. means mentally disturbed. I was born and raised in the South Mountains up here in Burke County, North Carolina. And back in the early 30s, my daddy used to make moonshine back in them mountains, and he used to like to drink it, too. I asked him one day, I said, "Daddy, what's the longest drunk you ever been on?" He said, "Son, I was up in the fields of planting tomatoes one day and got drunk. Said when I come to, Mom was canning them." It's true, my daddy did used to get on them long drunks. One day when I was a kid, about 10, 12 years old, my daddy'd been on a drunk, been gone about a month, and my mama sent me and my brothers out to find him. We searched all over them South Mountains. A couple hours later, went over a little old hill and seen my daddy and a friend of his and down on their hands and knees on the railroad track crawling up through there. We got a little bit closer, and I heard my daddy's friend say, "You know, this is the longest set of stairs I ever been on." Then we got a little bit closer, and I heard my daddy say, "Man, it ain't the stairs bothering me, it's these low handrails I can't stand." My father used to also brag about all the good-looking women he went out with before he got married. Said he went out with this real good-looking woman one time. Said she was level-headed, too. I said, "Daddy, how'd you know she was level-headed?" He said, "Son, she had the same amount of snuff running out of both corners of her mouth." You know, there's a town up there in South Mountains, about 12 miles from where we live, called Morganton. I was up there in Morganton one day and looked down the street and seen my daddy coming down through there. He had one foot up on the curb and the other in the gutter limping. I walked up to him, I said, "Daddy, you drunk again?" He said, "Thank God, son, I thought I was crippled." He used to also sell moonshine back down the South Mountains, and one day this stranger come up to him and wanted to buy a quart of moonshine. My daddy said, "Hey, wait a minute, I recognize you. You a preacher. Ain't you Jim Baker?" Jim said, "Yeah, it's me." My daddy said, "If I sell you a quart of moonshine, you ain't gonna drink it, are you?" Jim said, No, this is for my wife's constipation." So my daddy sold him a quart of it. A couple hours later, Daddy was up there in Morganton and looked down the street, and here come Jim Baker down through there drunker than a dog falling over trash cans. Daddy walked up to him and said, "Jim, I'm disappointed. I thought you bought that for your wife's constipation." Jim said, "I did." Said, "Boy, ain't she gonna poop when she sees me." We was also real poor back down South Mountains. I remember one morning I broke my arm eating breakfast. I fell out of the cinnamon tree. We didn't have but one old piece of fat back in the house when I was growing up there, and we had it tied to a string over the kitchen door. So every morning we'd get up and walk through there and swallow it and keep walking, that string, jerk it out, and the next one come through and swallow. Make you think you eat something, grease your throat. Mom got ready to cook beans. She'd take it down, dip it in the beans, and hang it back up. When I was growing up there in the South Mountains, we eat so many possums, I had two brothers and sister got killed trying to cross the road. You are what you eat. You know, people's always complaining nowadays about not making enough of money. My daddy said they should have worked back in the Great Depression, 1932. He used to have to take kraut biscuits to work with him. That's all he had. He said he got sick and tired of eating them old kraut biscuits, and everybody lined their dinners up on a wooden table in brown paper bags and lard buckets. He said right before dinner time he went out there and found the biggest and the heaviest bag he could find and set his kraut biscuits down in the place of it, traded with somebody. He said the whistle blowed, he went running outside and under a big old tree, said he jerked that bag open and there's 7 walnuts and a hammer in it. You ain't as bad off as you think. Never had that much to eat up there in the South Mountains. There was 10 of us in my family, but we did have manners. My daddy made sure of that. I remember one evening right after dark, we was all 10 sitting around the supper table looking at that last biscuit. Nobody'd reach for it because it was bad manners. About that time, the wind blowed out the old kerosene lamp, and I heard my daddy scream. Mama lit the lamp back, and there was my daddy's hand on that biscuit with 9 forks in the back of it. Like I said, there was 10 of us in my family, and I was the last one born. By the time I was born, my mom and dad lost all patience of raising kids. They potty trained me with a shotgun. And do you know, to this day, man, pull a gun on me, I poop all over myself. My father never did have driver's license. We never had no old car or nothing like that. We always had to walk where we went. If we ever went to town, we had to ride the old town bus. And when we rode the town bus to Morganton, we'd always sit there on the bench at the old courthouse there in Morganton and wait for the bus to come back and pick us up. And there's a lot of strange things happen while me and my father was sitting down there at that old courthouse. I remember one day we was sitting down there and a bus pulled up, but it wasn't our bus. And this bus pulled up, and this lady was trying to get on this bus and had on a real tight dress, real tight down around her ankles. And without looking back, she just reached back to unzip it, and she tried to get her foot up on the bus again and still couldn't get it up there, and so she unzips it again. This man standing behind her just got aggravated and picked her up and throwed her on the bus. She turned around and slapped the snot out of him, said, "You pervert." He said, "What you talking about, lady? You unzipped my fly twice." There was another time me and my daddy was sitting there on that old bench and seen this crippled man coming down the street, and he's dragging his foot sideways like this. And he met this other feller coming in the opposite direction, and he was dragging his foot too. This first feller leaned over and said, "Vietnam, 1964. This other feller leaned over and said, "Dog poop right around the corner." He's just trying to get off. Also, back in them mountains, we didn't have what they call indoor plumbing, had these old outside toilets. And like I said, we had a big family, so we had a 2-seater. You know, you really have to get along good with your brothers and sisters to share a toilet with them. And you know, it's true, all them rumors you hear about Sears catalogs. We actually used the Sears catalog till 1964, and then they come out them colored pictures. They was so slick we had to go back to using leaves. I remember one day me and my daddy was out there in that old outside toilet, and my father got done and he's pulling his britches up and a quarter fell out of his pocket down in the hole. He looked down in there a few minutes, pulled his billfold out and throwed $20 in there with it. I said, "Daddy, what in the world do you do that for?" He said, "Son, you didn't think I was going in there for a quarter, did you?" There's another real cold winter morning, me and my daddy's out there in that same toilet, and he'd pulled his coat off and hung it on a nail. He got done, he reached to get his coat, and it slipped and fell down that old toilet hole. He went outside, got him a big old stick, and come out there churning that thing around. And I said, Daddy, my Lord, you ain't gonna wear that, are you? He said, no, son, but my dinner's in the left-hand pocket. Finally, that old toilet we had rotted down. My daddy had to build a brand new one, and he built the prettiest toilet you ever seen in your life on the crest of a hill right above the creek. After he'd got it built, I went out there and leaned up against the outside this toilet, and it starts a rocking. And you know how a kid is. I just kept rocking it further and further. About that time, it got overbalanced, fell off that hill down in the creek. Man, I was scared to death. I went running back in the house a little bit later. My daddy come in there and asked all us kids who pushed that toilet in the creek. And you know, I remembered a few days before that in school reading about George Washington cutting down a cherry tree. And you know, he told his dad the truth about it and got out of it, so I thought I'd try that. I said, Father, I cannot tell a lie. It was I who pushed that toilet in the creek. My daddy beat the snot out of me. About 10, 15 minutes later, I finally got my breath. I said, Daddy, George Washington cut down the cherry tree, told his daddy the truth about it, and got out of it. I said, why'd you whoop me? My daddy said, son, George Washington's father wasn't in that cherry tree when he chopped it down. When I was about 11 years old, I asked my daddy one time, I said, Daddy, why don't you go to church? He said, son, I went to church 2 Sundays in a row about 10 years ago and got both eyes black. I said, Daddy, how in the world did you do that? He said, son, the first Sunday I went, he ended up sitting behind this great old big fat woman. Said we all rose to sing a hymn, and there's her dress all wrinkled up in her butt. My daddy said I didn't figure she wanted it like that, so I jerked it out. She blacked my eye. I said, Daddy, I understand that, but how'd you get your other eye black? He said, son, the very next Sunday took a friend of mine, George, to church with me. We ended up sitting behind that same big old fat woman. We all rose to sing a hymn, and there's her dress all wrinkled up in her butt again. Said before I could warn my friend George, he reached over and jerked it out, and I knowed she didn't want it like it, so I shoved it back. It's the truth. Back in 1965, my daddy was called to jury duty up there in Morganton. Said while he was on jury, they'd had this long-haired, smart-aleck hippie. And this old hippie never would give the judge a straight answer. And every time the judge had asked him a question, judge asked him, said, what's your name, son? And he said, so-and-so. Judge said, where do you live? He said, here now. Judge said, what do you do? Old hippie said this and that. Judge said, I'm going to have to lock you up, son. Old hippie said, when to get out, Judge? Judge said, sooner or later. They also brought in this little old mountain feller from way up there in the South Mountains. He didn't know nothing about law or nothing. Just an old dumb country boy. But he had been married, had about 16 kids, and his wife had divorced him. And he had got behind on his alimony. And that's what he was doing in court that day. His wife got up there, and she had the judge, a jury, and everybody cried. She finally hushed. The judge stood up, pointed his finger over at that little old fella and said, sir, I'm going to see that your wife gets $100 a week. He jumped up and said, "That's mighty nice of you, Judge. I see if I can't give her a few dollars myself." My daddy said also while he was in the jury room back there deliberating or whatever it is they do, trying to make them life and death decisions, he said he was sitting there minding his own business. Said this big old woman flopped down in a chair right beside him, looked over at him real mean looking, you know. Glared at him and said, "You know, somebody's deodorant ain't working." My daddy looked back at her and said, "Well, ma'am, it must be yours. I'm not wearing none." Also back in the early 30s, you know, run them old country stores up there in the mountains, and it was back before they had deep freeze and freezers, you know, to keep their meat fresh in. And these old country stores would have a big old chest of ice under the counter. Now, the owner of the store could see in this chest, but the people, the customers coming in from the other side of the counter could not see in them. It was a Friday evening, and this gentleman was trying to sell the last chicken he had so he wouldn't have to throw it away. It wasn't going to make it over the weekend. So this lady come in about closing time, walked up to the counter. He said, "Can I help you, ma'am?" She said, "Yes, sir. I'd like to buy a 3-pound hen." So the old storekeeper reaches down in that chest of ice and rattles that scrawny old chicken around in there, the only one he's got. Throws it up on the scale. He's got his thumb on it. It said 3 pounds. Lady looked at it and said, "You know, that's awful small. You got a 4-pounder?" He throws the same old scrawny chicken back in that chest of ice, rattles it around a little bit more, and throws the same chicken back up on his scale. Got his thumb on it. It said 4 pounds. Lady looked at it a little bit. She said, "You know, that's still awful small. Just give me both of them." But you know, now that I've grown up and had to buy groceries and stuff like that, you know, I can understand how my daddy felt, even though a gallon of kerosene back in the 30s and stuff was a nickel a gallon. Compared to what they made then, it was still expensive. There's a little old store below where I lived. I'll not name it. But I'm not saying his prices is high or exaggerated. But I went in there one day and told him I wanted $1 worth of tomatoes, and he said, "I'm sorry, Roho, we don't slice them." I do a little bit of remodeling every once in a while, and you know, some people's crazy. I went down that Lowe's hardware store. I think it was down in Hickory, North Carolina. I walked up to the counter and I told this fella, I said, "Yeah, I want to buy a bundle of 2x4 studs." He said, "Well, how long do you want them?" I said, "A pretty good while. I'm going to build a house out of them." Back in them mountains, we didn't have much of education. I finished the 7th grade, and I think my oldest brother had about the same education as I did. And he always wanted to be a state patrolman. That was his life's dream. But up there in Burke County, you had to have a high school education to qualify. But that don't slow us down. So he lied on the application, said he'd finished high school, and he got the job as a state patrolman. He was proud as a peacock. But they was getting ready to fire him because he couldn't spell real good and didn't know how to fill out the accident report. And one day up there right in the middle of Morganton, they had the awfulest accident ever was. This poor old feller is just pieces of him scattered everywhere, right in the middle of the boulevard. My brother's out there trying to fill out the accident report, standing right in the middle of the road, and he's describing what happened. He looked over to the shoulder of the road, seen this man's leg laying there, so he writes that down on his report. And then he gets to looking, and the man's head's laying right in the middle of the boulevard. So he starts writing this. He said, man's head in boulevard, B-O-L. That ain't it. Let's see here, B-U-L. No. Let's see here. Man's head in ditch. You know, I've been married about 22 years, and back before I got married, I took my girlfriend out to get her a mud pack for her face. About a week later, a friend asked me, did it help her looks? I said, yeah, for a couple of days till it fell off. But my wife was from Burnsville, North Carolina, up in Yancey County. That's also the mountains. Me and my wife first got married about a month later. We went down to the Hickory Municipal Airport to watch the planes take off and land. We'd never seen nothing like that before, you know, from the mountains. Oh, it was real exciting. We were standing there watching these planes, and a pilot walked up to me. Said, y'all want to take a ride? I said, no, sir. I said, we ain't got no money. He said, well, if you promise not to scream, I won't charge you nothing. So me and my wife pile on this little old airplane. It's one of them open cockpit jobs. He gets up there turning flips and doing all this fancy flying. A few minutes later, he lands. The pilot walks up to me and says, well, I don't guess you owe me nothing. You didn't scream. I said, boy, I was about to, especially on that last loop when my wife fell out.
That's the truth.
You know, I used to deer hunt a lot, like most people, before they got married. And even after I got married for about a year, I'd deer hunt and stuff like that. But my wife got to complaining that I was gone too much. So I'm going to have to either take her deer hunting or give it up myself. So finally I decided I would try to get her interested in it. Went down to the sporting store and got her this camouflage outfit, this big 30-06. That's a gun. I dressed her up real pretty, and we went up to Lake James up there at a place called the Wolf Pit. I took my wife in behind some of these laurel bushes here and told her to sit down there on that stump, and I said, a deer comes by, you can shoot it. I get her all settled down, and I just sneak on off across the mountain and go deer hunt. I was gone about 15 minutes, and I heard awful this commotion. Guns are going off. It sounded like a war. Lord, I went running back down that mountain and pulled up behind these bushes where my wife was supposed to have been deer hunting. And I heard her behind there arguing with some strange man. I heard her tell that stranger, get your hands off my deer. I heard him say, well, lady, let me get my saddle off of him and you can have him. So that was the end of my deer hunting career. I'm going to tell you the only joke my wife's ever told me in the 22 years we've been married. She said these two surgeons was up in this apartment house, about the 3rd floor, this motel. There's an argument over who's the best surgeon. They got to looking, this owl was sitting out on a limb asleep. This first surgeon raised the window, jerked that owl in there and took its hemorrhoids out, put it back out on the limb, didn't even wake it up. This second surgeon, not wanting to be outdone, reached out there and brung in that same owl, took its tonsils out. Put it back on the limb, never even woke it up. Next morning, this blue jay flew up on the limb beside this old owl and said, Mr. Owl, man, you look rough. That old owl turned its head over real slow and said, yes, sir. Said, I felt fine last night. I woke up this morning, I couldn't hoot worth a poop or a poop worth a hoot. You know, I got a few things to say about automobiles, cars. You know, I just have never liked them old foreign cars, them Nazi Nissans, Toyotas, them old funny named cars, you know. I went down to the Toyota place one time to try out that little old Toyota. They said it would turn on a dime. The only problem was it wouldn't run over one. A friend of mine had one of them little old Nissans, little old small car. Had an accident and the airbag flew open, had to cut him out of the trunk. You know, I bought me a brand new Chevrolet one time, and I was driving down the road from the car lot, and the law pulled me over. He said, "Sir, you know your wife fell out about a mile down the road?" I said, "I was wondering why it got so quiet in here." Has anybody here heard about that new invention the Ford Motor Company come out with? It's a little old heater, goes on the back bumper, keeps your hands warm while you're pushing it. A friend of mine had a Ford one time, traded it for a dog, said if he had to walk, he wanted some company. It's the truth. This has been Roho M.D., and I've had a fine time with you folks. I appreciate it a whole lot. Thank you very much.